here today with Chris, and I think you would really like his life story and the project that he has done. And we will talk as well about the project we have in mind for the future. Can you tell us a little bit about your life story, about your childhood?
So yeah, my childhood, I grew up as pretty much a normal person in society. I grew up with a loving family, as I say, and I found that as an only child, I needed something more that I couldn't get because I didn't have no brothers and sisters. My nan, she only lived maybe 3 or 4 doors away from us growing up, and she fostered many different children. So children that were removed from sort of their normal family home. So the children that had autism, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, there were many different disabilities that they suffered with. And I found my love as sort of the sibling kind of relationship with my nan's children that were also going through a traumatic time. Unfortunately, when it got to around the age of 13 years old, my nan developed a brain hemorrhage. So it was very, very sudden. And one day I was at secondary school. The next day I was being picked up from school by my mum, being told that my nan was in hospital, that she was in a coma, and we didn't know what the state of play was. So I remember going to the hospital as a young child, and then as sort of the days went on, it was very, very apparent how unwell my nan was. And as a young child, it was described that she had a blood clot on her brain, which was known as a hemorrhage. And we had to make a decision as a family to whether she would continue life moving forward. Would she be kind of normal within that? Or was it better for herself to be able to kind of turn off the life support machine on which was keeping her alive at the moment? And we made that decision for her to turn off the life support machine, so, because we just didn't feel as though that she was going to come through with the better quality of life that she deserved and that she wouldn't have wanted. It was at that point there that my family sort of broke apart from each other, and I mean, sort of a lot of rivalry went on between my nan's side of the family and sort of the other members, if you like, sort of from my granddad's side, and there was a big division. So within that, there become fighting and contesting over wills on who was entitled to this and who was entitled to that. And then at the same time, the children that were living with my nan at the time and residing within her care, they had to be immediately placed somewhere else because there was no longer that family home structure for them. So it was traumatic for everybody within the situation. And my mum kind of turned and spiralled out of her control from losing her mum, in which turned a lot of hatred from my perspective for not receiving the love from her and more receiving the love from my nan. And we just kind of clashed. I mean, there was too much similarity there. And when we clashed, I found myself resorting to sort of smoking cannabis to begin with, to then heavy drinking, to not wanting to associate so much time at home. And then before I knew it, the street community became that sort of sibling love that I kind of once sought after with my nan's, sort of the foster children that lived with my nan. The streets sort of became that as a sort of a consequence to that. I mean, I no longer had people I could look up to as my brother and as my sister, do you know what I mean, and have that kind of trust and bond away from my parents. And I very quickly spiralled out of control to where the streets became my normality. I mean, I remember from my early years spending a lot of the time down the skate park and not wanting to be at home. My mum sort of turned into her own addictions, and we just become battling every day, more and more and more, and it just became worse and worse and worse, to the point where I actually had to relocate away from my own family home. And as I say, the street community, the people that I was involved with that were heavy addicts themselves, they became that olive branch that I needed. But I think it was the trauma that I went through for the reason to why I resorted within that. And before I knew it, that became my normality. I was turned into a very, very heavy addict. I started petty crime, do you know what I mean? Theft from shops and theft from one person to another to feed addictions and to try and impress the community. I mean, I say the community to try and impress what I thought was my friends, but what they were actually doing was taking advantage of me and peer pressuring me for sort of the vulnerable state that I was in into doing things that I wouldn't normally do, just to be able to try and get that love that I craved, the love that I craved from my mum, which I wasn't getting because of her addiction, and the love that I craved from my nan, which was no longer around. So from that, it just kind of got worse and worse and worse, and before I knew it, I was mixed in to this lifestyle in which I never thought I would become part of. And from sort of my younger teenage years, I experienced what it was like to live in sort of a temporary accommodation of a bed and breakfast, but I had no means of being able to cook for myself. I didn't understand what to be able to eat, what to do, how to even live, or for instance, how to be able to do washing. And I can remember one of the first meals that I learned how to cook was a jacket potato and beans in a microwave. And that was only because I was sitting there and I was watching Blue Peter, and that was one of the things that they suggested to do. My mum had shown me things like this, and my nan had shown me things like this, but because of the trauma, it's like it just left my brain. And then I become so focused on using drugs, and that becomes sort of my main centre point of happiness. And before I knew it, that them substances became my friend, and that became my joy. So if I didn't have these substances to be able to use, I then didn't feel complete within myself. Just very, very quickly, it threw in from one small addiction from smoking cannabis and drinking, to then sniffing cocaine, to then escalating up as far as smoking crack cocaine on a daily basis. So when people used to get up in the morning and drink the coffee, the first thing I'd be thinking of is how do I earn my money to be able to smoke crack.
And how do you earn that money? Stealing? Begging?
It varied. I mean, when I was younger, I wasn't so much as in the world of begging. I didn't understand it. I sort of kind of resorted, to say, to the petty crime in which my friends were encouraging me to do at the time, and that would be to go into the shop and nick a bottle of wine and would sell it for a £5 or a tenner, and then that would pay for me to have sort of a rock of crack back then. But really what was happening is the people that I saw as my friends were cutting little bits off to give to me and dishing it out, and they were keeping a majority for themselves. So it was a case of I was channeling to feed their addictions as well as to feed mine. And then if nobody had any substances to take, there was an aggression amongst everybody, and then I felt as though I had to commit to do something to be able to restore that happiness, in which I then got the love in the return from my friendship. But now I know it was a case of I was being taken advantage of. Do you know what I mean? Back then I didn't realise it, but looking back sort of as an older to those years, that's what I saw become the issue. And I didn't understand anything more. I thought that by doing something to help somebody in that way, that then that would provide me with what I needed, which was friendship. But really what I'd learned from a young age is what a true friendship wasn't. Do you know what I mean? Whereas I should have been educated enough to be able to know the difference between a true friend and somebody who was generally just taking advantage of me. But at that time, you don't realise, you're kind of living in that moment. And it's very difficult to be able to get away from that moment when you create it to be your normality. And as I grew up older and older, I was kind of bounced around from many different services, and social services were a big part of my life. They ended up having to support me financially at points because the system wouldn't help me because I was so young. I couldn't gain access to state support, just wasn't available, and I didn't know what to do. I mean, social services used to give me these little vouchers, and they were sort of like food vouchers for Summerfield it was back then. And I can remember going there and first of all buying microwave meals, and that to me was like a chance to eat properly, because you just had to put it in the microwave and ping it for a certain amount of time. And I can remember there was a little fry up that used to come in the microwave, and that was like my main go-to. But then I realised that I could take these vouchers and I could sell them to sort of local taxi drivers at the time, and that was giving me a cash facility in which I could then use to be able to exploit and get more drugs. And from there, I seemed to incentivise myself, right, how do we make this cash? because it's this cash what's keeping people around me and keeping me happy by giving me these substances. So I started going without food, and my daily tasks became, right, let's go and earn some money so that we can get happy. And that's what it became. Before I knew it, I didn't understand how to maintain that tenancy in the addresses that I was in, and I started quickly falling out with sort of homeowners or other people in the properties where I was living, and I was outside in the raw elements of the streets. To begin with, I remember being a confused sort of younger, and I remember trying to hide away. I was fearful because there was so many of these stories from where people have been attacked on the streets. I didn't know what to do. I spent some days wandering around, not sleeping, not eating, just to try and find a place of safety. I remember sitting in woods at points, not understanding to what life actually was. I tried to rekindle a relationship with my mum, but it's like we both at these points just chose our own different ways. I mean, she'd gone through her problems that she was going through with the trauma, and I'd gone through mine. And that kind of put up a brick wall and a barrier between us both into actually helping each other, in which we should have done as sort of mother and son through that trauma. And then I kind of understood the streets more. The more and more as the days went on, the more and more I was connecting with people that were outside in these elements, sort of on the raw basis. So I'd connect with the ones that were in the doorway as a beggar, and I started to pick up on their habits of how they were earning money. Do you know what I mean? For their survival. But it wasn't for survival, it was for their addictions. So then, as you do when you're a child, you start to replicate what your parents would do, and that's how we all learn. The people that were older to me on these kind of streets floors became what I idolised and what I looked up to and what I thought was right. And I chose to duplicate what they were doing to earn finances, thinking that that was giving me happiness, because I was then benefiting more, do you know what I mean, than what I would ever done in the petty stages of my life, using more and more substances in which I thought was giving me more and more happiness because I was fulfilled, rather than the struggles to fund my addiction like I had it become easier. But then again, the community kind of attached itself to me as a younger and kind of shepherded me around, and I become that weak target in which they could take advantage of, or they could leave plotted up in a doorway, and they'd come back and they'd collect money off me to go and score for me, and then they'd come back, do you know what I mean? I'd be given what I thought was the value for the money for what I'd given them, but they were actually undercutting me on every single scale. And then before I knew it, I kind of, as the years went on, I started to connect with drug dealers myself, and I understood the differences for the quantities that I was being provided by the street community and by the elders, and I kind of tried to push them away from what I was earning from my addiction, and I solely kept that for myself. And now I would approach the drug dealer when I had the cash facility, in which then meant I was using more, my tolerances then grew, and it just became a day-to-day life to me to fend for myself in such a way.
And how long did your addiction go on for?
I wouldn't even like to be able to give a timeline, to be honest, but my addiction started from very, very early in my life. I mean, I was under the age of 12 when I first started using cannabis, and then it just lasted for many years. I mean, what year are we now? It's been about 6 years or something, 7 years, in which I've stopped using sort of all substances. I've had a sort of a relapse every now and then from very stressful times, but I've not been a heavy addict to what I was, and I've not used the substances of the harder substances like crack cocaine in some time. But there's something just flicks in your head, do you know what I mean, at some point, and I realised that in my life I wanted more, and it hurts to even think that back then that's what I was like. But there was always a part of me that knew that I needed more, and that I deserved more than the situation that I'd chosen to be in. Around the age of 18 years old, I had my first child, and I didn't even really know how to be a parent because I didn't understand the parenting aspect for me. I just understood that kind of lifestyle of addiction. I wasn't able to be the role model on what I needed to be for my children, or for my child at the time. I formed a relationship, I got my own property, and then quickly was getting this rental money being given to me, in which I still chose to then use for an addiction. Do you know what I mean? And fund a higher quality of life to which I couldn't actually afford. But I didn't know the difference between paying rent and to have this money to spend on yourself. So no matter what I did, I just couldn't maintain that tenancy. I didn't know so much as how to be in a relationship because I didn't understand almost what love was. So to be loved by another person, it wasn't love back then. It was almost like we were physically and mentally abusing each other. So that was from the trauma that my partner at the time, my baby mum, had experienced. And from what I had experienced, it was just like we had this connection of trauma, but the connection of trauma just then pushed us apart. And for the next few years on, we both battled individually with addiction problems, from drinking and smoking to having yet again another child within the mix. And I still didn't understand myself. I thought that what I was trying to do was to be that solid family unit, but it still didn't change because my mentality up here had not changed. What had actually changed was my surroundings around me, and I become more independent within myself, and I'd kind of grown up away from the street community taking advantage of me, and I had now become that person from what the street community were doing for me. And I would almost pick on the weaker ones, so to speak, to get my support and move forward in the midst of having this relationship breakdown. And before I knew it, my children ended up being signed over to my mum and dad. I was in a lifestyle of having drugs and drug supply, so I'm being pushed around me. I was battered and broken, and as I say, I still gripped the fact of using drugs. That was the big crunch point. And then, as I say, when I was now older, back onto the streets, I knew what the predatorial part was like from being younger and how people would take advantage of you. I understood the abuse that you would get as a homeless person, being a beggar, all the criticism that you'd suffer, the assaults that you could go through, because I'd witnessed it in my younger years.
Have you ever been attacked in the street?
Yeah, I've been attacked numerous times. I mean, I remember one day I've been kicked in the face when I was sleeping. So I had petrol doused all over the top of me, and I woke up before somebody had actually ignited me, or I would have passed away at that point. I had my possessions stolen. I was spat at several times, physically attacked, and had sort of like beer cans thrown at me, as well as verbally abused every other day. I mean, it must have happened 3 or 4 times a day to be verbally abused, just from the average words of go and get a job, you're scum, you dirty tramp, all of these different things. But I learned to be able to detach myself away from what they were saying and know that that was just something that just they said to everybody. It wasn't just to be taken as a personal attack towards me, because I'd learnt that from what were my elders in my younger years. So I kind of fighted through that process, and it became my normality. It was only sort of 2015 to where I met a gentleman on the street, to where I thought somebody was that love to me. Do you know what I mean? They gave me an opportunity, or what I thought was the opportunity I needed in my life. And I started again. They took me away from the streets. They gave me a little education on life. And before I knew it, I'd actually put myself in an even bigger trap to what I was in before. So this guy kind of lured me away from what was my family and my community, even though I saw them as sort of each one was out for their own, being an addict. we still had times when we were chilled together, or when we would use drugs together. So they were like my foundation in life. So if I was attacked, do you know what I mean, and somebody saw me being attacked, they'd come and defend me. I would do the same for them. And we just become this family unit that was almost like unstoppable in that kind of aspect. We all kind of did the same thing. But this gentleman saw how tight the community was in my area and decided that he would sort of manipulate me away from that. And as I say, what I thought was giving me a better life by him educating me on what to be able to do, how to be able to get help, and in some cases financially supporting me or making sure I eat, got clean clothes and showered. When he pulled me away from that, I then realised that it wasn't the sort of the sunshine that I thought it was to be. I mean, he turned into sexually assaulting me over a duration of time, and I was trapped inside a property in a whole new part of the different country to what the jurisdiction says, and I didn't know how to escape. I couldn't. I just didn't know what to do, and it was at that point when I felt like that was the end. Like maybe I was encased to be a prisoner for somebody else's game.
And how did you get out from that situation?
It was very difficult. I mean, to begin with, I had to kind of deal with it, if you know what I mean. I had to kind of accept what was going on. That was the first stage. Well, the first stage was denial that was going on. Do you know what I mean? I tried to coerce myself that wasn't, that maybe I just put myself into a different way, do you know what I mean? But yeah, then it was almost like I can't even explain it. My brain was just like overload constantly of fear. And in that fear, the first thing you try to do is, I say, through the denial, you try to run from that fear. But I couldn't run.
He locked you inside the house?
I was in a house in a different area or in a different country from what the jurisdiction says. And I couldn't get out. I didn't know anybody. He'd taken my phone away from me. I had no contact with anybody I previously had contact with. And I can remember the last contact that I ever had was sort of on my phone was the police force ringing me up to ask whether I was okay, because my mum had not heard or seen from me. Now, this was the first time that, to me, I felt a genuine care from my mum. And the guy who was sexually assaulting me was stood in front of me. And I've got the police to my ear, and I can't get out of the property I'm in. So I just said what I knew the police would want to hear. Do you know what I mean? By saying, I just don't want to talk to my mum, I'm okay, I'm starting my life again. And I gave them the positive to know that they wouldn't then want any further contact. And when I put the phone down, he then immediately took my phone from me. And it was at that point that I felt that was it. It was over. Because I didn't have that connection to anybody anymore.
Were you scared for your life?
Yeah.
Was he aggressive?
He was very, very nice to begin with, but in the niceness, it was aggression, and in that niceness, it was fear, and I just couldn't fathom what it was, to what and why it was happening to me, or whether this was happening to anybody else. There was points when he left the property and left me in it, and I didn't know, shall I run, shall I not? So I tried getting out the windows, and then I realised I couldn't get out the windows. They were almost sealed shut. So as this guy was going out, there wasn't a lot I could do. So I started to talk to him to try and understand him, because I didn't know what else to do. I thought, if this is my life and this is the way it's going to be, then I need to kind of accept what's happening to me. And in having the sort of discussions with him, he then must have put some form of trust within me, because he gave me a laptop, he gave me a phone, but they were different devices to what I didn't have the connections to any of my friends or family with, and he heavily monitored everything I was doing on those devices. But I taught myself the world of sort of business, and I learned that what the guy was doing himself was, there was a lot of, on helicopters you've got numbers that are written on the back of them, a bit like a registration on the car, and this guy would sit in the front room and he would laugh and joke and buy these numbers off of the back of helicopters and say that he now owned them and other people didn't. Now they had to remove it because of him. So I learnt that he liked the concept of being in control very quickly, and the way that I felt I was under his control, but sort of a subliminal control. So in that there was also a sort of a satisfaction to him to have that control, which is fulfilled obviously by ego. Do you know what I mean? Everybody has that kind of, do you know, everybody has an ego, but he had this sort of grip to it, he wanted more and more and more and more, like a greed within it. So at this point I started to not mimic what he did, but I started to look at what would feed his ego and feed that control, to remove that fear control that he'd given to me and place it somewhere else, so that I could then kind of be free mentally. And I basically concepted many different ideas, and I tried every couple of hours, every day, to the point of where he got frustrated with my behaviours. He called me chaotic and manic, and he said he couldn't cope. And then he started locking himself away in a different room. And I thought, oh, now the guy that was around me for this time to almost hold me there was now so stressed that he had to take himself away from me. So it was at this point I developed a trust with him, but he was stressed with me. So a bit like the instance on how me and my mum clashed, there was then opportunities to be able to just go out onto the driveway, do you know what I mean, and get a breath of fresh air, because he's just physically losing it. And I remember one day I stood on the driveway, I had this phone in my pocket, and I looked at the woods in front of me, and I just run. I literally just run. And I can remember running through the woods, not even turning back to see whether he was chasing me. I just sort of get out of it. I don't even know where I'm running. I'm just running through all these woods. And then the car that he'd driven was a white car, comes screeching around the corner, and straight in front of me, and he grabbed me and he threw me down on the ground. Now, the phone that he'd given me had a tracking device in it. So when I ran, he knew which direction I was running. And he obviously heard the stones because it was a gravel sort of driveway. And then obviously saw me go into the woods. So he obviously became fearful to what I could disclose about him. And he immediately come and captivated me. So at that point I was now sort of like, that was my only chance to escape. So he took the devices for what he'd given me off of me. So I now had nothing other than him. So I continued that sort of aggravation, do you know what I mean, to deliberately wind him up at this point. Because I was just like, well, this is it, do you know what I mean? I'm either gonna have to react to you to get away from this, or there's gonna be a way to where you're just gonna let me go. Do you know what I mean? One way or another. But what ended up happening was I coerced him furthermore into his lifestyle with these helicopter numbers. And I mentioned to him that we could create a bigger concept than what he was already doing. And I basically expanded on his idea. But it was just something I created in my mind from the times that I had to, in fear, and to be away from him. Now, he believed this. And in believing it, I used it more and more and more and more to feed his ego. So much so that he thought that then I was going to benefit him massively, rather than just being this tool to him like I felt as though I was. And one of the options that we had to do to achieve this was to come out of this property we were in together and to go into a town centre. So we went into a Costa Coffee, and I remember asking to use the toilet. I went to the toilet and I collapsed. I pretended to collapse to get into an ambulance, thinking I could get out this way. when the ambulance came and picked me up, he got straight into the back of the ambulance with me. And then I felt fear to not even want to go to hospital, but to then get out of the ambulance and say, I'm okay. So I was back with him again. And then I didn't know what to do. But then I remember seeing a backpackers hostel. And this backpackers hostel kind of went into situ of what I'd been telling him. And I said to him, well, we can't be so far away if we need to be able to do this. I think this is the best place. It's cheaper than what you're paying now. And I made that suggestion to him. But in this backpackers hostel, it was only single rooms. So it meant I couldn't stay in the same room as him. So at this point, when it was coming around to bedtime, I went to my room, he went to his room. And I remember I found a screwdriver and I literally sat in that bed, lying down, or I say sat, I lied down in that bed with a screwdriver under my pillow because I still waited for him to come into this single occupancy room I was in. And I remember hearing the clock tick, tick, tick. And then it was at some point, early hours of the morning, I got up, I opened that door with a screwdriver in my hand, and then I remember tucking it in my jacket. And I just ran out of that backpackers hostel. And I went straight to this car park that I found. The first thing I found was a multi-storey car park. I went straight up to the top floor and I pulled off a scarf that I had on and I tied it around the handles because I felt safe up there. And I remember it must have been very early hours because it was still dark. And I waited and waited and waited for that sun to rise, panicking every time I heard a noise from a door opening downstairs in the car park that it might be him. But there was no him. Then in the morning a car come up the ramp. And when that car come up the ramp, I thought that was him, but it wasn't. And a gentleman got out of the car and said, are you okay? And I ran. I just immediately run. And when I ran, I went running straight to a police station. And I just broke down in tears in the police station. I couldn't even tell them what had happened. Just every time I tried to explain it, they even said it to me, do you know what I mean? Have you been sexually assaulted? And I said, no. Because there was still something in me that just wouldn't speak out. So I made up a bunch of rubbish to them that would then make them want me to leave their jurisdiction and come back to what was known as England. They took me to a place called the Welfare Fund where I got support. Wasn't enough support to be able to get out of it, but it was enough for me to be able to go and buy a packet of baccy, a drink, and get a little bit of train fare so that I could hit the borders of England again. And when I got back to these borders of England, I was in Newcastle, so an area I didn't know. And I freely wandered for a couple of days, just wandering around, knowing that he wouldn't know where I was. I didn't want to go back to where I was from in case he'd gone there looking for me. And I remember crying my eyes out to a homeless person over there. And the homeless person turned around and he said, I think it'd be good if you go to the police. And he took me to the police station and I got specialist officers and they sat down with me and they managed to talk to me and get it out of me to what happened. Unfortunately, because of the length of time that it had been between incidents happening, there wasn't a lot that we could do to be able to prosecute. And there was minimal evidence on me for as far as forensic testing was. But I was free. And that to me was good enough, that I was free. And I remember I had to walk around for a little while and I found this church that I went and sat in. And I would just read this Bible continuously, over and over and over and over. And I just had an obsession with it. And then the priest come and sat next to me one day because he was intrigued the fact I was in there most of the time just reading, not wanting to be outside in his elements. And I remember he put his hand on my leg and I freaked out and ran out of the church. But something the next day drew me back there. And the same priest come over and I was doing the same thing, reading the Bible. And he sat right at the end of this pew and he went, I won't come any closer. He went, I don't want to scare you. He said, but please, can I get you something to eat? And I remember at that point, I just cried. And he took me outside to this little burger van and got me something to eat. And had a little chat with me. I didn't tell him what had gone on, but he knew what had gone on. You could see it in his eyes. And then he went and got me some clothes, a warm sleeping bag, and he worked out a way of me being able to get safe to get back to my hometown. So I finally got back to my hometown, and I thought that maybe life will begin in the right way. It was a short while that I spent onto the streets again. This time I didn't want to use drugs because of the result to what was happening when I was being in that position to beg. And I sat there trying to find a way out, but the system wouldn't help me. So I was still with that no fixed abode, and this time I just carried on living in a tent. I thought it was better to stay on the outskirts, and that way I can't get intertwined with incidents that happened before. I saved up the money that I was getting as a beggar, and I found a little property in a Friday. I had enough to be able to get a rent in advance and deposit from what I'd saved, and I went and gave it to this house, and I thought I had my dream home. I thought, well, you've done it for yourself. So I mean, like, well done, and almost give myself a pat on the back. It was about a day into it that when I was lying in bed, because I remember having all this nice new duvet, and someone came into my room, flipped me out of bed, and I was thrown against the door. And then I remember having a gun put back to the back of my head. I was thrown down 3 stories that staircase, and then I remember seeing a knife straight to my face. And then it was at that point I'd realised what I'd put myself into wasn't the safe home to what I thought I'd found. It was when I turned around and I saw that I was in a room with a number of addicts, that what they'd actually done is taken my money as a vulnerable person, and they were there to also exploit me. And they robbed me of my possessions. Now, this wasn't even 12 months later from the events that took place. One took place in April, and then the following year, one was in February. So it was only about 10 months apart. And I remember going to the police. Well, first of all, I ran away from that. I remember being tied up to a kitchen cupboard. From this sofa being flipped around with a knife and being attacked. I had my hair cut, so I mean, by one of them, I can remember that. And they said, if you go, we'll still find you. And there were several threats made. Do you know what I mean? They took like saliva from my mouth, really like horrible and twisted ways, if you know what I mean. I don't know what the hell was going on, but I was almost being put under some form of like intimidation from them, like I was a bitch. And that's what I can remember. So they wanted to control me, how I was controlled as a younger. I remember being tied to a kitchen cupboard on my last memory, and it was by a leather belt, and I was on the floor being kicked in the face continuously, flashes of light, and that's what I can remember. And then it stopped because they were shouting at me because they couldn't make me unconscious. And I can remember, even still now, I can feel it to my face. And I didn't know what to do. I thought that was it. I thought it was it the first time when the incident took place from last year, but then I really thought this was it, because I remember rubbing my face with my nose, and there was just blood everywhere. And I can remember the blows to my face. I can remember feeling just this pain all around my eyes and my nose, and I didn't know what to do. They're shouting and screaming because they wanted to knock me unconscious, and they couldn't. And every time they then kicked thereafter, I laughed. And I laughed and laughed and laughed. And I think it was the fear that made me laugh, but it made them deliberately more angry. And then there was more and more of them that were becoming involved. Now I had maybe 5 or 6 or 7 of them that were on me, kicking me from all over, blows all over. And I was tied to the kitchen cupboard with one of them pushing my head down to the floor, with another full pelt kicking me in the face like my head was a football. And I remember my head just bouncing from cupboard to the floor. They then stopped and went out in the garden, and they left the kitchen cupboard sort of here, and there's a back door here, and I remember I could hear them sort of discussing in the back garden, and there was sort of smoking and having a chat what to do with me. And I thought, this is it. Do you know what I mean? They were one saying about organising for a van, and I thought, I'm dead here. I thought, this is it. And then this little Staffordshire Bull Terrier just come out of nowhere, come past. I remember hearing tap, 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 a bit like what Stormy does, on this wooden floor. And he come past and licked my face, and then went to the back door and turned around, and I remember looking straight into, I don't know whether it was him or her, but I remember looking straight into this dog's eyes, and this dog just, where the door was only prized open slightly, the dog just wedged this door straight open like it wanted to go in the garden. It went straight in between the middle of the group and started barking. At this point, they began shouting, the dog, shut up, just shut up, and I can remember hearing that. I knew that that was my opportunity. And I remember ripping my hands down, and this belt just snapped. Well, the jaw come off to begin with, this front face plate of a jaw, because it was like a fake jaw. And then I managed to snap this belt clean, and I just got up, no shoes on, no t-shirt on, covered in blood, and just had this bollocks to run straight out of the door. I remember seeing a wheelie bin with no lid, and I jumped from the floor straight onto this wheelie bin. I don't know how I did it. Hit the wheelie bin, over this wall, fell into a bramble bush, and then I remember having to hide under a car. Then they were all out through this back gate, running around shouting, looking for me. One found me under the car, tried grabbing me, and then I just remember trying to run. I was over walls, through bushes, just trying to do anything to get away. I didn't know where I was. And then I woke up on the floor in Co-op, I can remember, in front of sandwiches, really weird, like the meal deal section. And I remember some lady screaming because I was covered in blood, and obviously you could see evidently I'd just been attacked. Then the police were called. She didn't want me to leave Co-op. I was then taken away by the police. Got to the hospital where I had like x-rays and scans, and then had to discuss with the police what had happened. And the police decided that because of the seriousness of the crime that I was put underneath witness protection based on what had happened to me. And I remember the police officer sitting there, and he was asking me the story of the event, and I explained to him about this dog, do you know what I mean, and where I woke up in Co-op, because they were like my vivid memories. Even though I remember being kicked in the face, and they stuck out like I thought it was like a sore thumb. And he told me to reverse the letters of dog, and it was God. D-O-G, and it went G-O-D. He said, do you not think someone wanted to save you? And then when I mentioned about the sandwiches, he said to me about the bread of life and the body of Christ. And I just felt this love, because I remember the incident that took place the year before, that it was that man in the church that showed me love. And he showed me the love that what I was looking for my whole life from my mum. But I found the right kind of trust and the right kind of love. And he took me from there to a little hotel. He brought me McDonald's. He put on the telly and he said, please don't watch the news. He gave me a phone. I wasn't allowed to talk to anybody, but he went and picked up two of my friends that I'd known from school, and he brought them over, and he stayed in a hotel room next door. They stayed for a couple of hours and then he took them away again. But he said, do not watch the news. And I watched the news, and I saw the incident to what had taken place to me on the telly. And now I realised why he didn't want me to watch the news, because I nearly died. That's what the telly kind of showed to me. I didn't realise the seriousness to what's taken place until the news reporters were explaining the incident that happened. And I went through a witness protection programme. I had care in there for maybe 3 or 4 days, and when I was put into sort of housing support, I couldn't cope being in a hostel setting, so I chose the streets again. But when I chose the streets again, I had this sort of I don't give a fuck attitude. I had the drive to not want to use drugs, but I also had the drive to not want to go through either of that again. And I remember sitting there ignoring the fact of everyone else using drugs and knowing that I was there to save people the same way that I was saved. And I channeled every negative emotion into a positive action. And I just grasped this concept and just drilled everything into it. Every time I felt sad, I'd pick it up because that would make me happy. And that became my drug. And I refused to remove myself from that spot of being homeless until I took everybody, bear in mind the people that had taken advantage of me, till I took them away from those elements so that they did not even have to worry about going through what I went through, because I realised how unsafe it was on those streets. And the support that I received was phenomenal. I remember barristers come out, do you know what I mean? Teachers, priests, vicars, and I had these respectable, professional people nurturing me like a family. And I just couldn't believe it. I genuinely couldn't believe it. They become concerned when they didn't see me in those specific areas to where they knew me to be. And they supported me in ways where I never would have thought I'd had support before. I mean, I was given access to be able to go to a gym, to be able to have a shower, in which someone paid for my membership. But it wasn't just a shower, I was able to have a jacuzzi and a sauna, and it's almost like live an upper class life. I had these vouchers to where I could go and get food, do you know what I mean, and not be in the elements anymore. And then on top of that, they were buying me equipment to support me in what I wanted to be able to do. And these people were working with me, encouraging me the steps that I needed to achieve what I wanted to achieve. And then I realised I had a purpose. And my purpose wasn't just for myself, wasn't just to help people try and be safe. It was to take the people that were unknown to the elements and educate them on the harsh realities of the elements and show them how they can support people like myself to where they didn't know how to. And the more and more I explained to them what to be able to do to help somebody like myself, the more and more my community got the right help that they needed. And I started to watch them change, because they were no longer given large amounts of financial capital to spend on drugs. So they were reducing their intake. They had fresher clothes on, do you know what I mean? They were being looked after. You saw them happy. And you saw them doing things which gave me life. And that's the only way to explain it, and that's where my shelter project started from. From the love that people showed to me, now they want to be able to give it back in a new way. No, I don't know.
What a story.
Proper story.
You've been through a lot.
Well,
It's good that you're using that now to help others. You transformed everything into positive energy.
yeah.
It's really good.
But yeah, it's hard to be able to get over it. You know what I mean? It almost feels like my life's been a dream. That's what it feels like. It feels like it's just been one bad dream, but with good dreams in between it. I suppose that's what everybody's life feels like, but it's hard.